I'm Ryan Mitchell with The Tiny Life. Today we have a special guest, Taylor, who's going to be talking to us a little bit about towing tiny houses, transporting tiny homes. I know this is a big question that I get a lot of times, and I had myself when I actually built my tiny house. Where I built it wasn't exactly where I ended up living at it. So I actually had to move my house right out of the get-go as soon as I finished it across the city. And that was an interesting journey. I'll share that story here in a little bit. But Taylor, to kind of kick us off, tell us who you are and kind of who you work for and why you're here today.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks so much for having me on. I really appreciate it. So like you said, my name is Taylor and I'm a tiny house transport specialist here at One Call Logistics. We move tiny homes all over the nation for various different builders, contractors, everyday tiny housers, just like people on the show, obviously. Um, and I feel like I've seen it all when it comes to transporting tiny homes, the ins and outs. And I'm just excited to dig in today.
Awesome. Cool. So I think I have a few questions. We'll start with those and then we'll kind of see where the actual conversation leads us to it. But, when someone is first looking at moving a tiny house, I think to set this up, most people, and I was one of them, I've never moved something so large, so long. In many cases, I think a lot of people have never even towed a big trailer before, right? So if I'm thinking about transporting it, whether it's myself or through a service like you, what are some of the things that I need to be thinking about when it comes to moving a tiny house from one place to another?
Right. So there's a lot of things that you should think about and take into consideration when, getting ready to prep for a tiny house or considering moving it across the country. And I think it'll go into detail as we move forward through the conversation. But I would think about the location of the tiny home, where it's coming from and going to, as far as weather conditions. Are you moving it in the summer or are you moving it dead in the snow in Montana?
Mhm.
Um, I would think of, the person who you are thinking about towing the tiny house, just their experience. Um, was it built by a tiny house builder? The house itself, was it built by a tiny house builder? Or did you build it yourself? And I always like to reiterate myself when it comes to this. There's nothing wrong with anyone building their own tiny home. We just always ask because sometimes, different things come up, whether it be built by a builder or someone else. So
Yeah.
we always like to ask that. Um, and then I would kind of also think about the weight distribution in the tiny house. That's going to determine how the house pulls. There's so many different things I could go on and on. Weather conditions is very big though. So.
Okay. So you mentioned weight distribution, and I think that's something that a lot of people don't think about, and it's one thing that I kind of harp on people for because the way that your weight is distributed really impacts how it's going to handle going down the road. Could you talk a little bit more about weight distribution of trailers and what kinds of things that people need to think about there?
Yeah, so absolutely. Yeah. You want to make sure the weight is distributed as even as possible, obviously. Um, we see it a lot where a lot of the weight is well in the back of the tiny home. And if you think about that, with all the weight being in the rear and there's no weight sitting on that front of the hitch where the tiny home is hooked up to, especially with it being like a standard ball hitch, bumper pull
Mhm.
tiny, that's going to cause a lot of swaying. If you think about it, the rear of the tiny home is going to sway. And depending on how much weight's back there will obviously determine that. But making sure the weight is even. We've had scenarios where it's been significantly bad, where we'll go buy sandbags and
Yeah, okay.
actually put sandbags in the front of the tiny home where there's more weight to help on that hitch, and it helps.
Interesting. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Okay, so you kind of offset some of that weight. And now you can only probably do that so far, right? Because the trailer's only rated to a certain rating.
Right. Yeah. So knowing your trailer's GVWR and what it can handle is going to be, crucial. And that's another thing I was going to go into when, transporting a tiny home is knowing how much weight your tiny house can handle. You don't
Mhm.
want to be overweight. That's going to cause a lot of problems. We've experienced that so many times. You have a tiny house that's a double axle, let's say 14,000 pound GVWR, and it's weighing in at 16, 17,000 pounds. Um, Most of the time, it doesn't tow the way it should. We've had we've had them who've towed just fine, but you really shouldn't overload it, and it can cause a lot of stress on the trailer itself and those axles.
Yeah. Um, Two things I'll mention here is I have a post about tiny house weight over at the Tiny Life that you can go check out there. It breaks down a lot of the terms, the GVWR and all those kinds of things, the tongue weight. I get into a little bit of the distribution of the weight, things like that. But I think one thing I always talk about with the trailer is I see a lot of people trying to save money by going a used trailer route. And too many times is like they're basically buying a lot of unknown with the trailer. Like they think that the trailer's rated to this amount, or they looked at the axles and they think by looking up the model number, they were able to figure out what the rating was or something like that. Sometimes it's stamped right there. But my general advice is to always go new. It's the foundation of your house. It's something to not mess around with. Obviously, like if you're towing something that's 10, 16, 50, whatever thousand pounds down the road, if it goes wrong, it doesn't just kind of go wrong. It goes wrong in a really bad way. And frankly, that's where like someone could get hurt, whether it's you, the driver, other people on the road. And that's just like, one, we don't want to do that. Two, that's a lawsuit waiting to happen.
Right.
Yeah. So like it's something that I always like strongly urge people to buy a new trailer and to actually buy a heavier weighted trailer than what you think you need, because it's not just the house, right? It's also all your possessions. It's also all the furniture. It's all the, if you have a water tank, water is pretty heavy, especially if you're, not draining it each time you move. And then there's other things that can add up to kind of overshoot what you thought your trailer was. So I always suggest putting in a big safety margin when you're speccing out your trailer and calculating how much the building materials that you're going to have are going to weigh, all the possessions and things like that. So when it comes to weight and towing, are there certain like rules that people need to know about? Like there's a maximum of weight, or you need a specific driver's permit or designation when it comes to weight?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So as far as GVWR, and like you said, you have that location on your website where people can look up what it means and things like that. There is, and I totally 100% agree with you. And I had actually made sure I was going to make that clear when you're buying a trailer. Make sure if you think your trailer, sorry, I apologize. I don't know why it keeps pausing.
Okay.
When you're using like a 21,000 pound, you have a 21,000 pound GVWR on a triple axle trailer. That's what we're seeing most often. But a lot of times we're seeing people buy these double axle trailers, even if they're brand new, to save money on the longer ones per se, and then they're overloading these. So my biggest suggestion is to buy spend the extra money on the larger trailer and get what you want out of it. And if that means you have to kind of cut some expenses in the actual inside of the tiny home, or wait a couple weeks, things like that, it's way more worth it, rather than getting on the road and overloading that tiny home where those axles can give out. Another thing we see, like you did, is we see people buying old mobile home trailers. And trailers, and honestly, it's not fun at all. It's always an issue. And that's why we always ask to see photos in advance, because it can really make or break a situation, being traveling down the highway and something falling off of that old trailer and being anything or hurting someone. So definitely an interesting situation when people do that. But we try and help everyone out, and obviously transport all the tiny homes that we can. But we do have to say no to to some of them.
Yeah, yeah. With certain weights, there's like different classifications. Is there like certain points that you have to have, like a length or a weight or something like that, um, to transport a certain house, like a CDL or something like that?
Exactly. So, if you want to haul over 26,000 pounds, and this is, uh, vehicle and tiny house. So, just for example, because this sometimes gets confusing, I know it's always been confusing for me when I got into it. If your truck weighs 10,000 pounds, and then your tiny home is 15,000 pounds, that's 25,000. That's
Hmm.
great. So once you get over 26,000, you do need a CDL to haul, whatever it may be, not even just a tiny home, but we were talking about those, of course. So you definitely want to be careful with how heavy your tiny house is. Um, we do have a lot of customers who want to move their own tiny homes, and they realize, well, it's 17, 18,000 pounds. Well, what type of truck do you have that can that can haul it professionally and safely and still be under that limit, like, you know what I mean, as far as having that CDL driver's license that makes you legal to haul it down the road.
Yeah.
So
Okay. And this comes up from time to time, but if someone wants to tow or transport a tiny house that's wider than normal, which I think is 8.5 feet, is that right?
that is, yes.
Yeah. So if someone's considering building a house and they would like to go wider than 8.5 feet, is that possible to transport? And what would be involved if they wanted to do that?
Yeah, so it's more than possible. We actually move them all the time, at 10 feet wide.
Okay.
I personally, when I talk to someone, I always recommend, if you could stay at 10 feet or less, not a problem. Just because when you're at that 10-foot wide mark in most, and I'll say most states, you don't have to have any type of escorting involved, big flags and pole cars and things like that. And the process is relatively simple when you hire like any type of legal, or licensed and insured transport company, whoever it may be. Most of the time, they're going to take care of the permits for you, and they're
Mhm.
actually not as costly as most people think. The only thing that's really required is a moving permit for each state that you're going to be traveling through, which can be done right online or through the transport company, obviously, of your choice. And then most of the time, that transport company is going to charge you additional for having a driver haul that wide load. Just
Yeah.
because, if you're hauling, I mean, personally, you've hauled your tiny home. Now think about that tiny home being a foot, and think about it being a little bit wider on each side, almost touching each side of the lanes.
Yeah.
Um, there's a lot that goes into it, but it's definitely doable.
Yeah. Okay. That's good to know. And one thing I like to point out with like the extra wide houses is it's not a lot of people will go from like the wall to the wall, but then what they forget about is that your roof eaves usually go beyond the outside of your house, and it's the widest point, right?
It is.
So yeah, you want roof eaves because so you don't have water coming down the side, so you're protecting your investment in your home and things like that. So yeah, it's 10 feet wide or less from the widest point, and that may not be the bottom of the trailer. That could probably be near the top, near the roof line.
Exactly. No, you're absolutely right about that. A lot of people don't think of that overhang. I know we're moving a tiny home up in Maine, and they had said it was 8.5 feet wide,
Yep.
but when I photo of it, the eaves on the side were well over, and they measured it, and sure enough, it's close to 12 inch
Yeah. Okay.
difference. I know it may not seem like it, but it is a very big difference when it comes to what's needed to move it. So,
Yeah.
absolutely.
I think my eaves are like 10 inches or so on either side. So that's 20, that's almost, 2 extra feet on either side. So, okay. So let's talk about, you mentioned the ball hitch, but then there's also gooseneck style or fifth wheel style towing.
Mhm.
What do people need to know about those two options there?
Yeah, so most of the time we see a standard ball hitch bumper pull or a gooseneck. Those are going to be highly recommended. As far as a fifth wheel goes, most of the time we see a tiny house that has a fifth wheel hitch. It's built on an old like trailer, which
Okay.
the way you do it, that's that's your choice. There's nothing wrong with it, but I highly recommend a gooseneck trailer. I think it's the most stable, and transport wise, it's what we like the best. It transports the best. It's a lot easier to tow on a big Dodge Ram dually. Sits perfectly. And there's that clearance when you're turning your truck more. There's more maneuverability when getting into these tight tiny house little communities that
Hmm.
a lot of people want them parked into. One thing, as far as like the bumper pool tiny homes, a lot of people do build the 16 to 20 footers on there. Those are no problem. They actually they go perfectly on those. The goosenecks are more style for like these large 32 to 40 feet tiny homes, because I'm sure, as you see, a lot of people are going really really big with their tiny
Yeah.
homes. They want that extra 5 feet, or the extra loft for for their kids. So as far as the bumper pool, up to about 32 feet is great. Once you're getting above that, sometimes it can be a little tough, even on a large truck, all that weight on a hitch. But ultimately, that's what the truck's there for. They're powerful trucks. And
Yeah.
uh, yeah, if I had to recommend anything though, over that size, it would definitely be that gooseneck.
Okay. So just to clarify, because I didn't realize there was a difference, fifth wheel is different from a gooseneck, correct?
Yeah, fifth wheel and gooseneck are totally different. One is like an actual ball hitch, and the fifth wheel is like more of uh, it's like a flat, round type of hookup.
Okay, gotcha.
You can add adapters to them though. A lot of people have fifth wheels that add gooseneck adapters, so
Hmm.
you can purchase those and do that too.
Okay, interesting. Yeah, I think like I when I first got into tiny houses, like pretty much every like I think the largest house was about 20, 22 feet, and they weren't that heavy, they weren't that complex, and so everything was built on a utility trailer. And that's what mine is. Mine is on an 18-foot trailer, and it's cantilevered off like 6 inches on each end, a little bit. Um, and over the years, I've noticed these things getting bigger and bigger, right? Like when I started, there was some houses just on a single axle, and then the big thing was, okay, now I got my house is so big that I got a dual axle, and now I'm seeing these triple axles that are these monster homes,
Yeah.
which I think, yeah, like you're saying, like those goosenecks are just a lot easier to tow those kinds of things. And the turning, from what I understand, is a lot easier just because the attachment point is so much further, usually like above the wheels, right, of the truck instead of off the bumper.
Yeah, exactly. The gooseneck, it hooks actually into the bed of a pickup truck. So if you think about a pickup truck, the gooseneck comes over, the pickup bed, and is actually inside of the truck. So the maneuverability of it, it literally goes over the side. If you need to make a tight turn, the
Mhm.
back is coming over the top of the side of the truck if you're trying to back it in into a tight spot, anything like that. So I totally agree. It's a lot easier.
Yeah. Uh, so um, one thing that you just mentioned about getting like these houses into little communities, right? And one of the things that I know was something I didn't plan for initially, but then I quickly realized was that like ease of access in and out of the place where you're going to park your house is so key. I've seen some people where they literally had to take down portions of fences to like go through the neighbor's yard to come in, and then it took them like 2 hours. They tore up the grass and all this kinds of stuff. um, when I did mine, I actually cut out a whole extra section of the woods to put in an additional driveway so that I could just drive my house in, and I never had to back up. I just pull in, unhook, and then I actually had like an exit to take the truck out without having to go back around the house or back up or anything like that. And then if I need to move it in the future, all I do is back in the truck and I just pull it forward and I can just take it. So what are some things that you guys are looking for or assessing, like when you're trying to figure out where you're delivering this thing, getting it in and out of the location that you're picking it up from and dropping it off at?
Yes, we always ask. We ask for a lot of different things, and there obviously is Google Maps to try and determine and look at the lot. But ultimately, I'm sure, as we all know, it only can show you so much,
Yeah.
and you can only kind of measure so much and go based off measurements. If it's going to an RV park or a tiny house community, we know that it's usually built where it you can get in there. One
Yeah.
where you have to maneuver for 2 hours. That's actually honestly pretty common these days. The way that they're so tightly packed or going into small
Mhm.
sections, it's actually common. I know that we were just at a delivery site for 4 hours, like 2 days ago.
Yeah.
Just getting into these spots, people are being a lot more, they want these things on tops of mountains overlooking, these beautiful views. So when
Mhm.
we're delivering to these sites, we're going through these back roads with 6% grades of clay and all kinds of craziness, and it can take hours and hours. So we look at a lot of different things, and obviously that reflects in the quote that's given when we transport these.
Yeah.
Just with everything, that that's that you need to move it. I mean, think about four-wheel drive. These going up. Think about pulling a 20,000 pound tiny home up a 6% grade of like clay in Washington. Um,
Mhm.
it's wet and it's slick and things like that. So there's a lot of different things that we take into consideration. I know that sometimes people will send us customers of ours will send us an actual map that they draw out, and people are getting really really good at these types of things, where they can show us how we're going to get in on their new property and maneuver it. But
Mhm.
it's ultimately very difficult to know right off, like a video and things like that, to see if we're going to be able to make it or not. We recommend, like, sometimes there's these awesome like little skid steers that you can rent
Yeah.
or have a come out and actually hook up to your tiny home. They're in a little bobcat, and they'll like literally maneuver it in, and they're a lot smaller than this big dually vehicle is.
Yeah. I know I have some land up in the mountains, and when they deliver, it's not a tiny house. It's like a manufactured home or a trailer, right? Like a single wide, double wide. They have like these two tracks that they literally have a guy with a remote control, and it is amazing where they can go with this thing. It takes a long time and it's expensive, of course. Yeah. So yeah, I don't envy any. Like I've towed a few things. I've towed my own tiny house, and that was pretty much in straight lines and not big curves and all that kind of stuff. So yeah, I can't imagine like some of the places that you guys have to go. That could be tricky, I'm sure.
Yeah, no, I mean, at least you've towed it that far, 45 minutes. We've had customers who, were like, we think we're just going to actually tow it ourselves. And we're like, kudos to you, because that's awesome. It's very challenging. And if you're up for the challenge, definitely do it. And then we've had some customers who have called us, just in the middle of the tow and said, hey, expected. And I said, no problem. That's what we're here for. We'll get it taken care of. Where are you? And it's been quite interesting, but it's so worth it. And it's really an awesome thing to see, like, where a lot of people are placing these homes at, and how they're designing them. It's incredible.
Yeah. Um, so that kind of brings it, like there's certain trucks that or size trucks and things like that that you need to tow some of these things. Um, and for most of us, we don't have these types of trucks because I mean, if you look at the prices, they're very expensive, right? Like these are some people might buy them, but I know the truck that I actually rented a truck. There was an agency that was a smaller truck rental place locally that allowed for bumper poles. most rentals do not allow for that. In fact, they don't have ball hitches on them at all. And in the terms of service, they prohibit it and all that. So it's very difficult to find a company that will rent you a truck for you to drive that has a towing capability. And for most people, like, I don't need a $50,000-$60,000 truck. I don't want that to be my daily driver, right? Because that thing guzzles gas. So what kinds of trucks are you guys using in terms of whether it's a model or a spec or something like that when you kind of do these tows?
Yeah. So in all honesty, most of our drivers all have the same truck.
Okay.
They're Dodge Ram Dually 3500s, and the tow on them is outstanding. We pulled like 26 and 25,000 pounds tiny homes, and these are actually quad axle tiny homes that are being built now too.
Wow, geez.
And they do a great job. We have a couple of single wheels, which we won't go over a certain weight. It really depends on the hookup. Like I said about a gooseneck versus a bumper pull, where a gooseneck can go on a like a standard Dodge Ram single wheel and still carry 20,000 pounds because of the
Mhm.
way it hooks into the bed. Whereas that style on a ball hitch, it's not as good, for the truck as
Mhm.
putting it on a dually would be. Um, that's our go-to truck, and that's what you're going to see most tiny house transporters using. Same as like an F450 or 550, whichever of those you prefer. Everyone's different, but like you
Sure.
said, the vehicles, they're expensive, and even just in the past couple of months, I mean, they're at like 70,000 right
Oh,
now.
yeah, I was gonna say, yeah, they're pretty
Um,
pricey.
It's through the roof. Yeah, we just actually put a deposit down on one yesterday. We had to order it because there's no trucks. We
Yes. Hmm.
and the pricing is insane, but the good thing about it is they want your trade in, and you know what I mean.
Mm.
They want your vehicle, even with miles and miles from transporting tiny homes on them. So that's a beneficial part, but the prices are through the roof, and um, a lot of people have said, should I just buy a truck to transport this? But if you're going to buy a truck, I would think you would want to transport it, and get your money's worth. And moving one time a year, I don't think really would do the justice of that.
Yeah.
So all about what you want personally. So
Right. Yeah. And the advice I give people is if they want to move their house once or twice over the lifetime of it, um, use a service like you're the one you represent. If some people really want to do this as like a full time on the road kind of thing, my advice is usually go get a camper, get that exploration kind of bug out of your system, then take it, figure out where you want to be, sell it, and then use that money as like the seed money for your tiny house. And just kind of, tiny houses are difficult to tow. Um, and they're also not very gas efficient because they're kind of pigs, right? Like they're not aerodynamic. I think when I towed mine, I was getting like 5 or 6 miles per gallon. Uh,
wow.
and
That,
I have some friends that are they travel full time with their tiny house. They literally keep a part time job just to pay for gas, right?
wow.
It's just incredible how much money. When they told me how much money they spend a month in gas, just kind of tooling around the U.S., it's really astounding. With like a camper or trailer that's meant to be aerodynamic, and it's much lighter. The walls are thinner, all the materials are lighter, and things like that. Those are still pretty big gas consumers, but they're not like a tiny house. So
No, I couldn't agree with you more. We kind of call them parachutes of the road because when you're going down the road, all it is it's like catching air like a parachute, and what that does is guzzle gas.
yeah.
Um, like we've had tiny houses that pull through the mountains at 4 to 5 miles a gallon. Um,
Hmm.
I think average is probably going to be between 7, maybe 7 and 8, 6, 7, 8. That's going to be average for us towing one, like a good size. But they are gas guzzlers, and the campers compared to tiny homes is insane. And I
Yeah.
think that the height of the tiny home, maximizing, most people go up to that 13 and a half limit, along with the material of it, it just catches air and then it
Yeah.
sways back. You're going even slower. There's a lot of different things that come into, when getting a tiny house on the road. And, gas is a huge thing. It
Yeah.
is. So.
Yeah. And then if you are moving full time, like then it starts to make sense to actually have one of these trucks. But like you said, 60, $70,000 is that's twice the cost of what it cost me to build my house, right?
Wow, that.
So, and that included all the solar panels. So, like that's not a small investment. And let's just be honest, like it's a truck, it's gonna depreciate in value. It's not like a traditional home where it's gonna kind of grow in value. Every mile you put on it, the value goes down. The second you drive off the lot, it's going to go down. There's going to be maintenance costs. You can get in an accident and lose. It's just not. It's a very expensive endeavor. So that's why I always say, like, hey, if you're going to, uh, if you do want to travel, get a camper, and then if you do want to live in a tiny house, kind of, you can move it, right? When you need to, like if you change jobs or something like that, or life circumstances happen that you need to move, that's fine. But yeah, I'm not sure that it's always the best idea just to be constantly moving in a tiny house.
No, I think it could kind of sometimes not necessarily defeat the purpose, but if your purpose is to live affordably, and I don't know how affordable that could be when you're constantly filling up your gas tank to move it.
Yeah,
Obviously, if you're just doing it to travel and you have those, that expense where you have no problem with it, so be it. But a lot of people don't, and the reason they go tiny is affordable living and having that freedom,
mhm.
which is awesome. So.
Yeah, and like just thinking about it, like $70,000, you could buy a lot of Airbnbs for a very long time, right? And just drive your own car or whatever, take the bus or something in between cities and things like that. So,
I Airbnb is huge, and people are putting their tiny homes all over
oh
Airbnb.
yeah.
Yeah, I'm with you on that.
All right, let me look at my questions here. So, okay, so we kind of talked about this a little bit, but why would someone want to hire a company like yours versus drive it themselves? Like, what are some of the considerations, and why would a person lean one way or the other?
Yeah, so we did touch base a little bit about it, but I think some of the main things why someone would want to drive it themselves versus hire someone. So I think the first thing they're going to think about is cost. Like we just stated, cost is a big thing, and a lot of times when you're transporting these tiny homes, it's not cheap to move across the country. So when we or another transport company gives them that quote, I think a lot of people do look into maybe doing it themselves, and then
Yeah.
they realize, maybe it's not as cost effective for us to do it. Maybe we should go with the transport company after, fuel expenses and then insurance.
Yeah.
So, do you have insurance on that tiny house while you're transporting it? Because a lot of these insurance companies won't insure a tiny home on the road. So, with us being, or us, or like I said, another transport company, you're going with a commercial company who carries that full commercial policy to cover your tiny home.
Mhm.
Um, we're seeing these tiny homes that are worth $200,000,
Yeah.
and I highly recommend, if you are going to tow it, to make sure that tiny house is insured. Hiring someone versus driving it yourselves, experience.
Yeah.
Um, have you moved a tiny home before? What's the weather like? Like I said in the beginning, are you moving this $100,000 tiny home, through, let's say, Nebraska with high wind speeds, and you're not really, a comfortable driver that handles these large vehicles. So I think experience, insurance, and all that good stuff is a good reason on how to weigh out your options of hiring versus going yourself.
Yeah. And I think the insurance thing is what I mean. like you said, you do the math and you start to see like why the prices are what they are. But then you also are like, wow, that's, I'm not going to buy a $70,000 truck. I can't even rent one. I can't buy a used one and save money. All these things, unless you absolutely have a truck already for another purpose, it's usually more cost effective and more practical to go with a company. But then with the insurance side of things, I like that was kind of like the cinching thing for me, because you could drive let's say your 6-figure tiny house down the road. You could be an expert driver. Everything could be right. It'd be a beautiful day. You go the right speed and a drunk driver slams into you, right?
Right.
There's nothing you can do about that. That's just how life works sometimes, unfortunately. And if you're talking about like an investment, like 50, 60, $100,000, like I don't know many people that can just stomach, or take that kind of financial blow. So yeah, okay, maybe you spend a couple grand to have a professional driver do it with insurance. But you're protecting yourself against the person who's texting on their phone while going 70 miles an hour down the road, or someone drunk, or someone's not paying attention, or something like that. Even if you are a good driver and you've had experience with this, but I think most people, let's just be honest, there's not a lot of people that have a lot of practical experience towing such large things down the road. So I think that's definitely not to be discounted, because the experience in this case matters when you're going 60 miles an hour with a missile that's 20 plus thousand pounds. Things
Exactly.
happen fast.
Exactly. They're big units. They're hard to stop, and you know anything can happen. And I just feel like sometimes that extra investment up front can really protect you, and it's usually worth it. Anything
Mhm.
to happen. That's what that transport company that you hired is there for, to help you. Um, and like you said, not many people have experience with hauling these big, huge units. I mean, maybe if you have hauled horse trailers in your life, things like that,
Yeah.
you know. But like I said, it's not always practical. So.
Mhm. So when people are thinking about it, like working with someone like you, and they're talking about the insurance, are there certain things that they should be asking about when it comes to what the insurance covers, what it doesn't, how much protection, things like that?
Oh, absolutely. So that's a big thing. I would first off always ask how much the insurance of the actual cargo covers. So when you're asking a transport company how much cargo insurance they have, really that's meaning how much protection is going to cover my tiny home.
Mhm.
You don't want to hire a transport company that only carries $25,000 in cargo insurance if your tiny home is worth 60.
Right.
Or if they can get a policy that increases that, well, that'll cover that, because that can be done. But that's definitely a good question to ask. Um, I would also ask. You can ask for a copy of it, and
Yes.
then usually you don't always have to ask the liability amount, because any really commercial policy, really for a transport company, is going to be $1 million policy.
Yeah.
You know, someone else is hurt, things like that, because it is commercial. But yeah, knowing the amount that the insurance covers is huge. Um, One thing we get asked often, and we've had it happen before, um, is tire damage. Transit
Mm.
units across the country, you're going to have tire blowouts on some tiny homes. You can't prevent that from happening. But most commercial insurance isn't going to cover damage to a tiny home due to a tire blowout. And
Interesting.
but yeah, we see it happen. A tire might blow out, and just from getting hot, just from anything. You can have a tire blow for any reason, really. But if it, kind of flies up and let's say just kind of scratches the side of the tiny home, leaving like a dark black mark, like um, usually usually the commercial insurance company is not going to cover that. That's not something that they want to take fault for. So
Yeah.
one thing us to our customers is, let's make sure these tires are in good shape. Let's try and avoid any mishaps so that we don't have any of these problems. Obviously, we've had tire blowouts before, and we always have handled them just like any other, anyone else. But that's a big thing. And I would highly recommend asking the transport company that you choose what their policy is on tire blowouts. You know,
Hmm.
it's a big deal.
Yeah, yeah. Um, just some things I want to reiterate with that is like definitely, if someone is going to transport your tiny house, ask for a copy of the insurance and make sure it's still valid. Because I've totally heard stories where people are like, oh, yeah, we have a policy. And they go and there's actually no policy. Um, Also make sure to know like if there's a deductible amount, like what that amount is, right? Because if it's, let's say, $10,000 or something like that, and you don't have $10,000, then you're out of house and you can't do it. But if, I don't know what the typical deductible is and who covers that and all that kind of stuff. And then I can't stress enough, if you're not moving your house that often, it's like, I think new tires for my tiny house would cost me like $500, something like that. Worth it, right? Just I've moved it once. If I ever move it again, I'm just going. Even though I have the tires, I'm just going to go buy new ones, right? Because I don't. They've been sitting out. They've been exposed to UVs and moisture and all. It's like it's just not worth it. Not for $500, right? Uh,
No.
yeah. So. Okay, so when beyond asking for like insurance and things like that, what are some of the other things that people should be asking a company who does towing services? Like, what are some of the other questions they should be asking when they engage someone like you?
So in the beginning, you asked about how many tiny houses, we've transported. I would definitely recommend asking how many tiny homes they've transported. You always want to ask. Like I said throughout the entire conversation, experience it's a big deal,
Yeah.
and getting that number is crucial. Obviously, some aren't going to know exactly, but a roundabout I think would help. Um,
Hmm.
Another question is I would ask, do you get to communicate with the driver directly? So
Hmm.
do you have access to contacting that driver that's hauling your tiny home at all times? Can you call him or can you text him and maybe when he stops he can get back with you? I think that gives people peace of mind, and that's something that we offer, is giving our customers the driver's phone number once everything's all set up and ready to go. Just because if you want to pick up that phone at 8 o'clock at night when that driver's stopped for dinner and is not driving, I think that they should be able to do so, to have that peace of mind, that reassurance. Every company is different, and they may say that dispatcher's the middleman where the driver doesn't want to take calls, but we think that speaking to the driver gives that reassurance that your home hands. And um, another question is what type of truck's going to tow my tiny home, which we talked about as well. If you don't, if they don't give you like an example, or if they say, you know, a Ford F-150, maybe
Hmm.
you want to look into, someone who has a bigger vehicle,
Yeah.
whatever works. But another question I'd recommend asking is, how do I prep my tiny house for transport? This
Mm.
is, I know I personally send a checklist to help clients out because a lot of these things you forget about. Like, how do you prep your tiny house for transport? Are you going to remove the photo hanging on the wall behind you, and make sure it doesn't like swing around? There's a lot of different things that I could recommend asking. I have a full list, and customers ask us, I would say, so many questions when booking. There's so many. I could just go on and on.
Yeah. Yeah. I know with like prepping it, obviously like taking stuff out or at least strapping stuff down. The nice thing with the tiny house is you don't have a lot of stuff, right?
Right.
So like I can literally unload my entire house very quickly. I think I moved into my tiny house in like 30 minutes,
That's
right?
all.
Yeah. So like, and it was like just one truckload. It was not a big deal. So I would almost just as a habit unload everything out so that it's just a bare house so that there's less weight. There's
Right.
no moving parts. There's nothing else that could additionally be damaged. And then, you have control over your personal items as well. And then I also see a lot of people, especially on the front face, is putting plywood over all the windows. and screwing that on. So, because, road debris comes up and hits it, and the road is like, I don't know, there's just so many ways that could get your house damaged, and it's no fault of a driver or anything like that. You go down the road and you see all the tire treads and the metal belts from other 18 wheelers.
Exactly.
And sometimes they sneak up on you, right? And they get thrown into the house and smash a window or take out some of your siding. So yeah, those would be 2 tips. Drain any water tanks if you have them. Obviously, you don't want water weight is 8.5 pounds per gallon, and it moves too, right? So like you don't want that shifting weight, which is just a nightmare, I'm sure, for people like you driving.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So let's see. Okay. Now, when people are talking with a potential company, are there any like red flags that like they should consider? Like, I see this, I hear this, that maybe I should be a little bit concerned, or maybe like move on to the next person, or definitely dig in and ask more questions, anything like that?
Yeah. I think ultimately I always say if it sounds too good to be true, it probably is.
Yeah.
And I'm honest, if a company says they're going to be able to move your tiny house across the country for, $1,000 or $2,000, I'd steer away and look into further. What I always tell everyone, as far as red flags, as far as cost goes, um, go on Google and look up at the top 3 tiny house transport companies, get a quote from each, and I can assure you that they're going to be near the same cost.
Yeah.
Compare it to the person that's giving you the cost. As far as like another like red flags, or I guess you could say, is like bidding, like U-ship and things like that.
Mm-hmm.
I don't really want to talk bad about them. I just recommend staying away from them, and unless you know who the person is that's bidding on it, um, I just wouldn't. I wouldn't go on and put my $60,000 home on a site where people bid to move it the cheapest. It just doesn't sound. It just doesn't sound so pleasant to me. But that's from my point of view, of course.
Mm-hmm.
As far as those red flags, that's really about all. It's really just those companies that are low, lowballing or bidding super cheap. I don't know where the drivers come from or how they're making it work, I guess you could say.
Yeah.
And like you stated previously, verify the insurance, because if if they're able to do it for so cheap, or able to move items at the speed they are and the cost they are, I would definitely recommend verifying the insurance.
Yeah.
Getting that, making sure the date is there, and making sure everything aligns with what's being said.
Right. Because I mean, we've talked some, big numbers here, right? Like a $70,000 truck, a person sitting in the car that's, has certain driver's license designations, insurance itself, right? Like all these things cost money, and real money. So, yeah, you need, like, obviously you as a company get to amortize some of these things across all your customers and all your jobs and things like that.
Right.
But there's still overhead. And if it's like you said, if it seems too good to be true, then it probably is. Now, I don't want to assume, but do you guys have like a contract that you work with a client when you actually book them for something?
We do. We have a full contract that, like, if the client's ready to book, we send out and they sign it.
Okay.
So it goes over certain details. But yeah, if you have questions about the contract, I can answer it, like certain things that are on it that, help the person who's booking, things like that.
Yeah. And this is something that I've seen so many times. And it's like one of my kind of soapboxes is like, whoever you're working with, whether it's a tiny home builder or a transporter, it's like, make sure that there is a contract and review it, right?
Right.
And too many times I've seen people not have a contract at all, or be like, oh, we never actually got around to signing it, or something like that. And I also think it's good practice, well, just in general, right? Because it keeps everyone on the same page. And then if you're vetting people and you talk to them, like, hey, do you have a contract? If they don't have a standard boilerplate contract, that probably should be a red flag, right? Maybe not a total, like, I'm going to bail, but like, if they're a professional who does this for a living, they're going to have something. And then if they start to kind of waver about giving you a contract or talking about the contract, or if you have questions and they kind of act defensive, or they're not quick to deliver a copy of their insurance certificate, those are things that I'm just like, nope, there's too many good transporters or builders, whatever the case may be, out there to not have those kinds of things. So
Yeah,
I think that's definitely something to be wary of.
for sure. Yeah, any legal transport company that you go on and hire, they should be able to present you with that contract, that DocuSign, whatever it is that we use,
Mhm.
and you should be able to read through it, and it will go over details about your tiny house transport. I know we have a certain section that outlines tiny house transport and our requirements and what's included, and that's definitely huge, especially with the insurance too. If company's not responding to you when you ask for a copy of insurance, or they ask for certain things, that's a huge red flag, and I'd probably just steer away and
Yeah.
see what I come up with.
Yeah, and then the last thing that came to mind was, you mentioned how you guys kind of try to look at like Google Maps and things like that, and you're asking questions about the pickup site and the drop-off site and whatnot. Like, if someone just kind of skims over that, or just like, yeah, I'll do it, $1,000 or whatever the number is, like, that should be another red flag for you too, right? Because that could, depending on where you need to take it out or put it in, they need to know the conditions to even be able to say yes to the job. And if they're kind of not asking those questions, that's probably a red flag as well.
Right, exactly. That's a big deal,
Yeah.
knowing where something's going, and they're how they're going to get it in there. You know what I mean? If they're not asking to see. Another thing is asking to see the tiny home. Not all companies will, and on certain units I won't, if I know they're being built by a certain company or
Right.
builder. But I feel like the more questions asked, the better.
Yeah. Yeah.
So that engage.
Um, if someone wants to move, they're trying, how far ahead should they start to talk to someone like you?
So we recommend a couple of weeks out to get all the specifics. It's going to take us, at least a week to schedule, to get you on, sometimes longer. And there's been times where we'll move them faster if we have one of our actual drivers right in the area. But we
Yeah.
always giving us about 2 weeks to figure things out, to figure out the route we're going to take, to find the safest route, and figure out how we're going to get the tiny house to the destination. So a good 2 weeks is good for us.
Okay. Awesome. Well, Taylor, I think those were the bulk of my question. Is there anything else that you want to kind of share as wisdom before we kind of finish up here?
No, it's just a reiterating of what I said. Just experience is big, and always make sure you know who you're working with, and what's being moved, or what you're not what's being moved. We know where you're moving
Yeah.
into, but just know who you're working with, and know that they have that experience in insurance moving that tiny home. I mean, we just we want everything to go smoothly, and get there safely, and we don't, we're here to help. So that's it.
Cool. All right. So, if people want to connect with you and your company, where should they come and find you at?
Yeah, you can find us at www.one-calllogistics.com. That's going to be our website. And then there's a couple links down at the bottom where you can check out our Facebook and our Instagram pages. You can see daily content of all of the tiny homes that we transport all over the country. Lots of photos and videos of really, really cool things. So check us out.
Awesome. Well, Taylor, I really appreciate it. And thank you for everyone for watching. And we'll see you guys next time.